Welcome. This online roundtable discussion is a collaboration between the Carter Center's Human Rights Program, which seeks to amplify vital discussions at the intersection of faith and human rights, and Justice Revival, an inclusive community of Christian faith dedicated to serving as a voice for human rights in the United States. I'm Allison McKinney-Tim, founder of Justice Revival and your moderator for today's conversation. This web forum was created to facilitate exchange and inspire action to advance human rights. It has hosted similar events, including a public conversation last year on harmonizing religion and human rights, which included former President Jimmy Carter, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, and Imam Omar Suleiman. We hope you'll browse related events and resources on this site and check back for future events offering a diversity of perspectives. Today, our expert panel will be reflecting on the topic of Christianity and universal human rights. The national context for this conversation is one in which the human rights of vulnerable groups, including migrant children, are continually contested and threatened. This administration's zero tolerance policy, mandating wholesale criminal prosecution of undocumented migrants, and the related previous practice of separating migrant children from caregivers, have been condemned by both human rights officials and religious leaders. UN official Georgette Gagnon explained that under international law, children should never be held in immigration detention or separated from their families. And numerous Christian leaders have concurred. After a conference late last year, the World Council of Churches and the Roman Catholic Church issued a statement expressing concern for migrant children and condemning the practice of separating families and detaining children. While the family separation practice has reportedly ended, reports on conditions of immigration detention continue to cause alarm. Child sexual abuse, poor sanitation, disease, inadequate health care, and deaths of 7 children in the last 2 years are all a focus of concern. Meanwhile, this administration continues to diverge from global structures for human rights protection. The State Department withdrew last year from the United Nations Human Rights Council, then announced earlier this year the creation of a new Commission on Unalienable Rights, tasked with, quote, fresh thinking on human rights, with reference to founding principles of natural law and natural rights. Hundreds of civil society organizations, including many faith groups, have called for the commission to be disbanded, fearing it could threaten minority rights that are yet to be fully recognized in the United States. So these issues have provoked outcry from Christian and interfaith leaders, among others. Yet we hear Christian voices on both sides of these pivotal debates. With this as our context, our panelists are here to help us gain insight on the relationship between Christian tradition and the ideal of universal human rights. We have an esteemed interdisciplinary panel of scholars, and I'd like now to ask each of them to introduce themselves. Dr. Richard Amesbury, let me start with you.
Thank you, Allison. It's a pleasure to join you today. My name is Richard Amesbury. I'm a professor of religious studies at Arizona State University, where I direct the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. I'm speaking today not in an official capacity representing the university, but representing my own views as a scholar. I'm not a theologian or a religious leader, but a scholar of religion and political thought who sometimes writes about the relation between religion and human rights. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Allison Bowden.
Hi, I am Allison Bowden, and I am a United Church of Christ minister, serving as Dean of Religious Life and of the Chapel at Princeton University. I have been a student of the intersection of religion and human rights for many years, particularly the rights of women of faith, women who are members of religious communities, and looking at challenges to their rights that come from within their own religious community. A book that I've written on this subject is called Women's Rights and Religious Practice.
Thank you. And Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite.
Thank you very much. I am President Emerita and retired professor of theology at Chicago Theological Seminary. In 1968, when I studied at the Sorbonne, I took a class with Jean Hersch, who was one of the drafters of the original Droits de l'Homme, the rights of man. And I will be referring to her during this presentation. More recently than 1968, I edited the Interfaith Just Peacemaking perspectives on the new paradigm of peace and war, which is a multi-faith perspective on a lot of the issues that we're considering today. And most recently, 2 weeks ago, I moderated a panel here, the Vail Symposium on Religious Freedom. And one panelist said, and I think it is worth repeating, that religious freedom is being weaponized. So with those self-introductions, I turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you. In our program description, we say faith traditions are well suited to probe the deeper reasons why all human beings possess inherent dignity, which entitles them to certain fundamental rights and freedom. So we've begun with something of an assumption or a position that we might consider and interrogate, a position about the propriety and value, perhaps even the need or urgency for religious traditions, including Christian tradition, to speak to issues of human dignity and rights from their distinctive religious perspectives. My question is this, and I'll direct it first to Richard Amesbury. Broadly speaking, how can theological or religious thought contribute to a conversation about universal human rights, which, of course, by definition, apply to all people, regardless of their religious traditions, nationality, or other characteristics?
So a question, I take it, Allison, has to do with sort of the relation between the particularity of the theological claims on the one hand and the universality of the human rights claims on the other.
Precisely.
Right. So I think this is an important issue. It's one that routinely arises, I think, when the relation between theology and human rights is thought about and discussed. And it would at first appear that there's some sort of mismatch between the particularity of the theological understanding. Theological understandings are grounded in particular traditions of human thought and discourse experience on the one hand, and then the claims about all human beings, including presumably people outside that particular theological tradition on the other hand. But I think on reflection, it becomes apparent that all discourse, including moral discourse, including discourse that makes universal claims, has specific origins. It emerges out of concrete circumstances. And so I don't know that there's anything particularly problematic about the idea that from within a particular tradition, including a religious tradition, you might make claims about what's true or right, which purport to be true universally. I think this is a characteristic feature of a lot of human language. And so I think the question more becomes how to think about the relation between the self-understanding, the theological tradition out of which those claims arise, and people in other traditions who may not occupy that same historical space and may think differently about what justice consists in or what the good life consists in. And there, I think there's a space for dialogue and debate. But I don't think that there's anything inherently problematic about speaking theologically about a problem of universal concern.
Susan Thistlethwaite, would you like to weigh in on this?
So how does religion engage human rights carefully? Carefully would be my answer to that. Because let me give a practical example. Our students went on an immersion experience to see what they could learn about the border so that they could come back to their local congregations and talk about it. And you have people who are convinced self-evidently that Jesus is at the border, that every child is the incarnation of a divinity that is in the image of God. You cannot treat people this way. And you have other Christians with quite a degree of sincerity interpreting the immigration policy as a necessary, even perhaps divinely given mandate from the ruler of this country. We didn't used to have rulers, but apparently now we do. And interpreting it that way. So that I think the first thing I want to bring out is contextuality. That in my 40 years of teaching theology, you can't teach theology in a vacuum. You need to teach it in a context. And this is crucial globally. This is why this commission is so incredibly dangerous, because it's taking, a certain subset of Western interpretations of a hierarchical, exclusivistic, perhaps even messianic Christianity, and seeking to import it into this country as the norm and export it around the world. So carefully is the takeaway word for me, because you've got to look at the context.
Thank you. And I wanted to draw out that important point you've made when you referenced the State Department newly formed Advisory Commission on Unalienable Rights. So already we heard Richard Amesbury talking about how it's not necessarily in theory problematic to speak from a particular tradition to an idea of universal human rights. In fact, any kind of source or ground for universal human rights results from some particular position, even if it's a secular one, if I've understood you well. And yet, then we hear Susan Thistlethwaite saying, well, in practice, this has to be done carefully because the actual way that religion is being applied to human rights is perhaps a double-edged sword. And so this actually brings me to another point that we wanted to frame, that we do see in Christian faith, as in others, interpretations that support human equality or support the extension of human rights to marginalized groups, and then interpretations that reinforce traditional hierarchies. And likewise, we see both a mixed historical record on human rights, in which Christian arguments are found on both sides of perhaps every pivotal debate about justice. We could name historic debates about abolition of slavery or racial segregation in this country. And then likewise, Susan Thistlethwaite, you've pointed out that this is very much the case regarding the issues of migration that we opened with at the top of the conversation. So my question then becomes, and I'll ask Allison Bowden to speak to this, how do you understand and how do you distinguish between these types of conflicting ethical positions, one that's pulling for and one that's pushing against the recognition of human rights of some marginalized group, but each of which is making a claim to a Christian identity or character?
Yeah, I think when it comes to Christianity, what makes our response to human rights situations particularly distinctive is, of course, the person of Jesus. And in every situation, Jesus blew open the boundaries of mercy and of compassion. And I can only imagine there might be some people who would say, from a Christian point of view, the incarceration of migrant children is the merciful thing to do. What would Jesus do? He would not say that that's the merciful thing to do. And in a situation like that, we would ask people who would say that it is merciful to put themselves in their own imagination in the place of a child in that situation, and then ask them, what do you think comprises mercy right now? And where do you think Jesus's advocacy would be? One of the positive things about intersecting religion and theological thinking, biblical thinking even, with human rights challenges is that they can really expand people's idea of what is going on, right? We can refer to the biblical doctrinal concepts of the sacredness of the human being in every situation. We can look at examples in the Bible, such as that Jesus, the infant Jesus, and his parents were themselves refugees who fled to Egypt to get away from a situation in which their child was certain to be killed. And this is what is bringing people to the borders of the United States as well. As you've been saying, Dr. Tim, the Christian tradition, really everyone, is so broad in the way it can be interpreted and the way it can be applied. I think those of us who have a very positive application of Christianity towards human rights challenges have a lot of blessed material to work with in terms of creating and always putting forward examples that expand our ability to be compassionate, expand our abilities to be merciful, and that challenge the ideas of some of our co-religionists who have a very different idea of what comprises mercy.
I hear you talking about centering the person of Jesus and even describing perhaps a practice of seeking to imitate the Jesus of Christian scriptures and how that sort of practice can deepen empathy. I'd be interested in other insights that any of the panelists might want to share about ways in which Christian thought, tradition, or conviction can make a meaningful contribution in support of a notion of human rights that extends to all, and in particular to those who are most marginalized and vulnerable. Susan Thistlethwaite, would you like to add to this?
Engaging the dialogue here. Yeah, Allison Bowden is making, even performing, if I may compliment you on that, Allison, one of the ways that Christian leaders can do this. That is, you do not cede the Christian position to those who claim to speak for all Christianity. That you have to step up and say, this is not what Jesus would do. And that in itself is difficult. I mean, I once accepted an invitation to be to dialogue with a fellow who was from a conservative seminary on was Jesus pro-peace or pro-war? And I thought to myself, I got this. I mean, I got all the material on my side. And he stuck exclusively to the book of Revelation. So, and I thought, wow, that's really cheating, isn't it? But Jesus is a Rorschach test for people's political perspective as well. But I think the way we can make a contribution is, with all of these problems, nevertheless, do not cede Jesus to those who want to put children in cages, because the voice of moral outrage is exactly what Christian leadership needs to be doing these days. And as Allison is saying, model compassion, because we have to teach.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few ideas of just some particularly, well, in the ways that they're expressing Christianity, contributions to Christian support for human rights. One of them I think of as the idea of the radical equality of human value. We talked already, Susan has talked about imago Dei, all human beings in the image of God. We get that from the Jewish tradition, and then Jesus and others, Paul, expand that out. But the idea of human equality is absolutely central to the human rights idea. And there are wonderful Christian arguments for its centrality in the Christian tradition as well. Another would be neighbor love. Love of neighbor is expressed so pointedly throughout Christianity. I think that's a very powerful theological tool to help some of our co-religionists think about what neighbor love means in any particular situation. When someone in the Gospels asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" he told the story of the Good Samaritan, the so-called Good Samaritan. And the answer is everybody. Everybody is my neighbor. I would say concern for the poor. The rights of the poor are one subset of human rights, certainly. But the tradition of Christianity emphasizes the rights of the poor and the welfare of the poor very, very much. Christianity also emphasizes an interrelatedness amongst all people. Dr. King and others have found other beautiful ways to express it. In the book Jeremiah, we read that our welfare is absolutely wound up with the welfare of everybody else. Just a few examples of specific items within the Christian tradition that can be drawn upon to give deepest support for the human rights idea.
A number of profound themes that you've named, Allison Bowden, within Christian thought that, as you point out well, are aligned to, perhaps even point to, the idea of universal human rights that gained cross-cultural and interreligious support in the last 70 years. And so we've heard a bit now about themes and thought and convictions within Christian tradition that would support or advance universal human rights. And yet we find ourselves in this interesting paradox that I'd like to take us back to. There is this new State Department commission, which has a statement of purpose which refers to our nation's founding principles of natural law and natural rights. And the commission that's been assembled includes learned scholars, yet one of the critiques is that it is not ideologically diverse, even as is required under federal regulations for such an advisory body. And its mandate with reference to natural law and natural rights at the time of the founding of this country has elicited concerns, including concern for minority groups whose rights have not yet been fully recognized in the United States even today. And so the question then becomes, in this particular instance of a forum where people are speaking from a perspective of faith, some from Christian faith to issues of human rights, there's concern that it might actually thwart or erode rights for some who are vulnerable. So my question then is, do you see this forum as one that is problematic, risky, or objectionable? And I'll ask Richard Amesbury if you'd like to weigh in on this question first.
Sure, thanks. Very generally, I would say that we should always be a bit skeptical of the role of the state vis-a-vis human rights. It seems to me there's a certain paradox built into the very idea of human rights, in that most rights are rights against the state. Freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. Who is it that those rights are claimed against? It's typically one's own government. And yet at the same time, one's own government typically is the institution that guarantees one's rights. States are signatories to international human rights declarations and so forth. So there's a certain kind of conflict of interest, I think, built right into the international system, in that rights, human rights anyway, are meant to be something over and above the power of the state, and yet to be guaranteed those rights usually requires the power of the state. So I think we're right to be a bit skeptical in this instance, especially given sort of the track record that you described earlier. I don't think it's just a problem with the Trump administration, though it certainly is that. It was also a problem with the Obama administration. The Obama administration, as you recall, was implicated in a number of human rights abuses, ramping up drone strikes, prosecuting journalists and whistleblowers and so forth. So I think we should always be a bit worried about what our government and other governments are up to, perhaps especially when they sort of cloak themselves in the discourse of human rights. That I think is something that is requires a certain critical reading.
A very interesting point about the potential conflict that is built into an international system in which state actors are the primary ones responsible for monitoring and overseeing their own compliance with international human rights law. We could think also about the State Department, with its focus on foreign policy, being the primary site of human rights reflection as compared to a national human rights institution, which the United States does not have, although international bodies have long recommended it, and many nations have that type of institution to oversee compliance with human rights across branches and levels of government. But what about this particular character of this commission, its reference to natural law and natural rights, its composition with a number of leaders who in particular have focused on religious freedom? I'll go to Susan Thistlethwaite. I see your hand there. Can you comment?
Yes, thank you. Full disclosure, I have signed numerous petitions against this commission. I think it's dangerous. I think it fits in with the current project of white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, and xenophobia. Look at the language, how the language is embedded, the inalienable right. Okay, we take that out of the Constitution. It seems like it's going to be fine. But from imposing Western values on other countries, it's our way or the highway. We don't respect where human rights may come from in Islam, in Buddhism, right? There's contexts in which rights come from different, though related, perspectives. Natural, how often has unnatural been used against LGBTQ people and women? Women's vote was unnatural. That was preached from American pulpits for a long time. There are ways in which I want to go back to this language because I think it is true. This particular perspective is trying to weaponize religious freedom. I think it is a dangerous project. And I think that, and I want to return to the topic of the best way to engage this is to engage it from your varying religious perspectives and not leap over the religion. But I do think that we have to come at it, and you, Allison, are in the law. We also have to come at it through the law, because you've got potential for being able to fire women if they don't dress in a feminine way, to fire LGBTQ Americans just for being Americans, under the guise of religious freedom.
And here you're referring to a lack of anti-discrimination protection for LGBTQ people. So there is not currently any federal protection for them against employment discrimination.
Quite, but then you are making here in Colorado, for example, we do have that employment discrimination protection. But should the Supreme Court rule that I can say, well, my reading of the Bible is that LGBTQ people are sinners and I can fire them, and this is not imaginary, this is a case, that my reading of the Bible is that LGBTQ people cannot be covered in workplace anti-discrimination legislation in Colorado or any place else. We've got this, and it still won't protect LGBTQ people in Colorado should this ruling go, in my view, the wrong way in the Supreme Court. So all anti-discrimination legislation is trumped by religious freedom.
So profound concern that an argument of religious liberty is used as a defense against anti-discrimination laws that would otherwise protect people against discrimination in things like housing, employment, and public accommodation. Allison Bowden, I wanted to ask if you would like to weigh in on this commission and its composition, and how you see the propriety of this sort of conversation about natural law, natural rights as it pertains to human rights in the U.S. system.
Absolutely, and you know what Susan has just been saying is right on. The use of the concept of natural law is very, very troubling. It's very problematic. I think of the idea of natural law, and perhaps I'm being too generous here, as being something that earlier eras came up with to try in their own best way, to come up with something universal, to come up with something accessible, to come up with some kind of baseline for order, goodness, and justice. I think the same thing about the human rights idea as it's articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and elsewhere, very intentionally a secular document, and importantly so. Natural law has been shown again and again to be a concept into which anyone can project what they understand to be natural and to limit the rights of other people by. Women are naturally subservient, women are naturally helpmeets, women are naturally disempowered, and that's appropriate and real and true. I mean, it's just another example of how it's deployed. And when it comes to the idea of religious freedom, around the world, when the American government uses the term religious freedom and tries to advocate for religious freedom, in many places there is a great deal of skepticism. Their experience is that we are going to advocate for the rights of Christians over other persons, no matter how large or small the Christian community is in a particular place. And that, to follow on what Susan was saying, that particular rights-denying ideas of what is a religious perspective will be used to trump other things. There is religious freedom in terms of interreligious engagement, but also intra-religious engagement. And we've mentioned the rights of women. This is often where the rights of women have a very significant challenge. It's coming from their own religious communities. advocating for their own religious freedom, especially when other actors might say, a practice of yours contradicts human rights law and your own country is a signatory to this and that. Again, the idea of religious freedom like that of natural law is just frequently deployed to defend really anti-rights agendas.
So if a commission like this were diverse, were interfaith, included perspectives, a broader range of perspectives from within any given tradition, like Christianity, would that be sufficient for it to have a proper role? Or is it really a question of which religious ethics and which religious beliefs can actually be reconciled with a principle of human rights to which our government, among others, is now committed and has promised to uphold under international law? So to say that again, would a more diverse commission, more theologically, religiously diverse interfaith commission, would that be more appropriate?
I absolutely think it would be more appropriate. It would also be important, as I think you are suggesting, Allison, that there be a diversity of theological opinion on human rights issues that would at least make for a robust discussion that would have some kind of balance to it.
Richard Amesbury, as a religious scholar, what's your view?
So I share some of the concerns that were voiced already. I don't necessarily object to the concept of natural law. I think it depends on the content and what one means by natural. For instance, Vincent Lloyd, who teaches theology at Villanova University, recently came out with a book called Black Natural Law, which is sort of about the African-American tradition of a higher law and the role that plays in politics. So I do think that if some of those kind of perspectives were able to be represented in this dialogue, the dialogue would benefit from that. Though my understanding of the way the commission is structured at the moment, that doesn't appear to be the case, and it remains to be seen what exactly the purpose or the function of this group will be. But I generally do take the view that a more diverse conversation tends to be a better one.
Susan Thistlethwaite?
Well, I will recommend an article I wrote for the Center for American Progress called Rethinking Our Policy on Religious Freedom, which, in fact, I wrote during the Obama administration. My sense in that, and you just Google that, okay, and I argue one key area of needed reform now. So this is the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom that I am writing against, and I wrote this after a symposium we did on this topic at Georgetown University, is how religion is understood around the world. So when, that term diverse is loaded. It is a really loaded term. What do we mean by diverse? I actually think were I, suddenly elected president, though I'm far too young to be a candidate these days, but nonetheless, I would want people with international grassroots experience, just so that you have a diversity of religions. Of course, you have a diversity of genders, races, and so forth. But a key thing that I have found, and Karen, I know you're an observer, but I know the Carter Center knows this so well. Those who work at the grassroots internationally understand far better than I, who, sit around in Chicago and write things for the Center for American Progress, how the interplay of religion, freedom, culture, gender, and so forth. And let us not forget the ever popular and most neglected theological topic, in my view, which is power. Religion is routinely marshaled to shore up very dubious religious power. And so, you currently have a very, very self-described religious person running Brazil, and he's going to kill the planet. So, that just doesn't necessarily mean do no harm. But people routinely politically use religion to accrue political power. So I would say the diversity I'd want to see is people who've worked at the grassroots around the world and know something about the complexities of this interplay. And that would be my number one criterion.
And that touches on another chief critique of this commission, that it was created without reference to the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which has long held primary responsibility for looking at human rights in U.S. foreign policy. So where do we go from here? We've talked about the challenges, the ways that religion could and has at times spoken to advance universal human rights, the ways in which we still see within Christian tradition, among others, very important human rights issues contested. I personally work with a diverse constituency of people of Christian faith who are positively identified with human rights and hope to speak from their distinctive voices of faith in a way that is salutary and beneficial to the movement for human rights. So I'd like to ask each of you to share what your thoughts are on what the best way forward is, and this could be whether broadly for faith communities writ large or for the particular communities of conscience that you know best. What are some ways forward to be a voice for justice, for human rights, to lift up the themes and the strands in the tradition that speak to greater justice and equality at this very crucial moment, and how to do that in the face of a strong sort of opposing religious voice? I'm taking volunteers for this.
The first thing I'll say is education. Is educating Christians and also others on the many ways that our tradition not only can support human rights, but is really necessary as a proactive player in the support of human rights.
Are there certain places, Allison Bowden, where you've seen that education done well, or certain types of education you're thinking of?
There are wonderful resources out there. I can just start with the Carter Center's own annotated Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which goes through every one of the rights delineated in the Universal Declaration, has scriptural reflection and commentary on it, really accessible and really capacious and global in its examples and input and thinking. Just one resource.
Thank you.
Just accompanying what Allison just said, there is no substitute for action. You can educate people about the poor, you can preach to them about the poor, but there is absolutely no substitute for partnering with them and going and feeding the poor. It's much easier to pontificate about immigration policy when you're sitting in the White House than it is faced with a child in a cage. So I think the the importance of drawing as many people in our communities as we can into the most basic kind of grassroots education, especially when you can do it with others who are a little different than you. In our interreligious engagement class at CTS, everybody has to pick a project, and they have to find the other religious communities in their neighborhoods, and then they have to visit them, and then they have to try to convince them to engage with them in a local project that will make the community better. Environmental, cleaning up rivers, this is one of the most popular of these kinds. In fact, environmentalism per se is one of the most commonly interreligiously engaged actions in communities around the country. So I don't want to substitute, I want to add the idea of engaged action with people who are a little bit not like you. And that notoriously helps people change their perspective a little bit and read their scriptures differently.
An important point, and proximity to those most impacted by human rights abuses. So the US Human Rights Network, for instance, holds this up as a central principle of its organizing, calling itself a people-centered movement with a focus on that same point.
Good, great.
Richard Amesbury, do you have thoughts on what's helpful going forward? What can people do who have concerns from within whatever tradition or none? And how can they respond to the challenges we're seeing right now?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'd like to sound a note of hesitation, or at least of caution, when it comes to the promotion of human rights. And I want to qualify that by distinguishing two kinds of activity that I think are understood when people talk about promoting human rights. So on the one hand, there's the sort of direct action that Susan was talking about, people wanting to address concrete injustices, forms of oppression, poverty, suffering of various kinds. And the language of human rights is often a kind of useful shorthand for the sort of injustice or violation that's taking place there. I think that's an incredibly important form of activity for people in religious communities, people outside them. On the other hand, sometimes what human rights is contrasted with isn't injustice, but other forms of moral reflection that are seen to offer a different sort of analysis of what that injustice consists in. So this is where I think a little bit of humility is important, and it kind of comes back around to what some of my colleagues have been saying about their sort of reservations about the promotion of human rights uncritically around the world. And that has to do with the fact that human rights as a discourse, as a particular form of moral reflection, emerged historically at a particular moment in time to address particular kinds of concerns for people who had particular understandings of what it was to be a human and the relation between the individual and the collective and so forth. But those understandings aren't themselves universal. From within these perspectives, people make universal claims, but not everyone shares these kind of understandings. And I think it's important to remember that when we're promoting human rights, we have to be careful that we're not simply engaged in yet another form of Western colonialism, exporting a particular brand, or even using it strategically to promote US interests abroad. Human rights is often a form of a tool of foreign policy, and less often, I think, turned back around to analyze our own behavior. And yet, for people who operate within the framework of human rights, that would seem perhaps a natural direction. So I think I would just sort of encourage a little bit of humility with respect to the language of human rights, and attention foremost to sort of what is the cry of injustice that needs to be addressed. Human rights is sometimes the appropriate tool to do that. It's not always. I think there are a range of issues that are sometimes better addressed in other moral languages, the environment, for instance. Also, I think, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's very much a document of its time. It encodes certain understandings of the family, certain assumptions about capitalism and private property, certain assumptions about nation states. It doesn't say anything about multinational corporations. There are issues that have arisen since then that I think sort of cry out for new forms of analysis. So I think that the language of human rights is incredibly important. It's also, of course, the language of law. And so getting people equipped to argue in those categories, I think, is very helpful and empowering. But there are other ways of thinking about problems, other kinds of problems that are better addressed in other idioms. So I wouldn't want us to become so sort of settled into a particular understanding of what human rights are that we're not attending to the underlying issues that sort of cry out for redress.
Thank you for those important points, several that I'll just pull out to highlight. One, looking at the Universal Declaration, as important of a document as that is, but recognizing it in historical context. Some would argue that any statement of rights is necessarily contextual. Also acknowledging that there are a number of critiques of the human rights movement, including a post-colonial critique. Is it used by powerful Western nations to continue to assert dominance over others? And then looking at the way human rights is invoked by any government, ours as well as others. Is it used very selectively in different ways against adversaries than allies? And so thank you for that, that critical commentary and reminder to approach human rights as critically as we might approach theology, for instance. I would offer a counterpoint to lead us to the next question. So Aryeh Neier, in his book on the history of human rights, he makes a really interesting case that it was the modern idea of human rights under the 1948 Declaration that first tied together social movements that were not necessarily related before that. So for instance, he talks about how the women's suffrage movement, once the right to vote was gained under the US Constitution, how it subsided and wasn't necessarily linked to the next movement for women's equality, which gained momentum later in the late 60s, early 70s. And so he's making the case that it was this notion of human rights and an overarching principle and framework that began to tie together different causes, abolition of slavery, ending racial segregation, women's suffrage, etc., into one overarching, or I'll call it systematic framework. So the question that I'll ask to Alison Bowden and Susan Thistlethwaite is, particularly given your scholarship around women's rights, do you see ways that the human rights movement has spoken to or informed Christian thought, particularly since mid-20th century? Or, oh, Susan Thistlethwaite, were you starting to answer?
Do you want me to start? I'm fine. I was giving the floor to Alison Bowden, if you want it, Alison.
Please, go ahead.
All right. Well, yes and no. Let me back into this based on what Richard's been saying. I just finished reading and writing an editorial about the Parkland students' March for Our Lives new peace plan, which is to rethink our whole approach to gun reform. And they are famous for approaching issues in terms of intersectionality. That is, the perspectives of gender, race, sexual orientation, class, national origin make a difference in terms of how you form a movement. So, speaking as a white woman, okay, universality has helped in a short term, perhaps. My own grandmother and aunt were suffragettes, okay, and activism comes naturally. But universality is widely resented and rejected by women of color who see white women as simply saying, well, this is the women thing and this is human and so forth and so on. So I really feel that this millennial generation has got that. They have got intersectionality. And at this point, universality in this particular context of trying to form a gender coalition that can resist an administration whose basic political philosophy is domestic abuse, we need to just complicate it. I don't find terms such as universality to be helpful. I actually find them interruptive. So that's kind of a long spiel, but I do think we need to mix it up at this point.
And with 4 minutes to go, Allison Bowden, the last word is yours if you would like it.
I'll just tag on to what Susan said. It may not be the right last words, so you go ahead and take it back. You know, when it comes to women's rights, and perhaps other categories of rights too, there have just been different sort of seasons of thinking about how to think about women's rights. Are women's rights a particular category of rights? Women need to have particular rights. Perhaps that's related to childbearing or other things exclusive to females. Or is it, no, women are not a subset at all. The human rights categories that we have always been talking about have to be applied to women as they are also applied to men. And each of these, the ways of thinking has been found to have strengths, also weaknesses. And we keep going through, I think, kind of cycles of thinking. I wonder what will come in and interrupt that next, both with the thinking on women's rights, but maybe other communities' quests for rights. Richard, to go back to something you were saying, I think that the human rights idea is the best international tool we have right now for creating and agreeing upon a baseline of human experience under which we will let no person slip in any situation. It is not a perfect tool, the human rights idea, and it's been used to imperialist ends, it's been used to anti-religious ends, and it's been used by some religious people to defeat some quest for justice. This is just an evolving conversation that's fascinating to me, and I only wish I had a crystal ball to tell us where it's going next.
Thank you, Allison Bowden. And that makes me think of part of Richard Amesbury's earlier comment on ensuring that we're keeping front and center the cry for justice and thinking carefully and critically about whether, how, and to what extent human rights can help us respond to that cry for justice, how those of us who identify with communities of faith do that, drawing from the cultural and spiritual resources of our tradition. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel of scholars. This has been a web forum roundtable conversation co-hosted by the Carter Center, the Carter Center's Human Rights Project, and Justice Revival.